Hey everyone, Pastor George here with today's Bible study recap. And in today's Bible study, we looked at Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. So this is the birth of Christ narrative that we get in the Christmas story, right? We've been working our way through the Christmas story as it's commonly told every week. And so we've done Mary, we've done Joseph, and now we get Jesus's birth and in Luke. Actually, we've already seen it in Matthew. You get one line in Matthew, just saying he was born, right? There's not a lot to it in the Gospel of Matthew, but in Luke, we're given a little bit more data and things that he wants to tell us. So it's just 7 verses, but actually this is probably one of the most powerful places to go when we want to challenge the tradition of interpretation of the Christmas story. Now notice, I don't want to say challenge the idea of the Christmas story, like that it happened or anything like that, but the tradition in which we have interpreted these things. And if you do not think you have a tradition, you do, right? Everything from thinking that there are 3 wise men and they showed up at the time that Jesus was born, to even when these things take place, to where Jesus was born, as in what location or where he was. And this is due to just the cultural tradition that is behind these things, right? And we'll talk about really 2 of those things that are present in this passage here. So in Luke chapter 2, 1 through 7, you get the narrative of Jesus being born. So John the Baptist has been born, and this is actually really important to place in the time of when this is going on. This is going to become important for understanding what's coming forward. So just to remind you, so like John the Baptist has just been born, you get Zechariah's prophecy, and then you get in verse 80 of chapter 1, the very last verse of chapter 1, it says, "And the child grew and became strong in spirit, and he was in the wilderness until the day of his public appearance to Israel." And then you get, in those days, right? In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus. So this is where our first interesting thing happened. So last week in Bible study, I talked about how Jesus might have been born, like people will say, in like 3 BC. And of course, that's kind of funny because it's 3 years before Christ. And this has to do with the timing of these events. And that's what makes it really difficult. So both Matthew and Luke agree that he was born under Herod, right? King Herod the Great. They say that in the beginning. It doesn't say it here, right, in this passage. But if you go back to the beginning, Zechariah is a priest under Herod, and that's when John is born. You know that John is not born that long before Jesus, so it has to be the same Herod, right? So you have King Herod, and it's definitely identified as Herod the Great in Matthew. So both of them identify Herod as king. Well, Herod dies in the year 4 BC. So what does that mean? It means that Jesus had to have been born sometime before 4 BC, right? So like, that's why I said 3 BC earlier. I meant to say 4 or 5 or 6 or something. You'll place him there, right? And that's the reason they'll do that. And so that is our first kind of issue that is there, right? Is that just the dating itself, right? As we like to, is that it doesn't line up cleanly with what later scholars did when they pieced together the dates, because they didn't have as much information as we do now, right? It's not their fault. They did the best they could, but now, like, if we actually wanted to correct the dates about like when Jesus was in the world, of course we won't have the exact date, although some people will attempt to do that sort of thing. You'll get somewhere, you'll have to add a few years onto our current calendar, so we'd already be in the 2030s or something like that. Kind of funny, right? And so Augustus here is also here. He's mentioned he reigned in Rome from 27 BC to 14 AD. So that's part of this time frame. And then you have this guy named Quirinius, who was governor from 6 to 12 AD. Now, if you were looking at this passage and you said, okay, this happens under Herod, but Herod's dead at 4 BC, and Quirinius is governor from 6 to 12 AD, so he's governor after he's dead. How do you square that circle, right? That's how I would think of it, right? Just logically speaking. And there are different answers to this, and I'm going to give you two that I've heard before and one that I've looked into recently and found kind of compelling. But of course, like, I think the first answer is acceptable. The second one, I don't really find is acceptable, but whatever. And then the third is the one I'm kind of into now, although you will always have to approach these things with humility. So the first one is that this is one I heard for a long time, is that there just were different censuses. We only have one record. This is the biggest problem with this argument, is we only have one historical record of a census being taken place, and that happens under Augustus and Quirinius in 6 AD. So that would have been when Quirinius first shows up to be a governor there. And so this is and so that's the only record of a census we have that takes place under Quirinius. And of course, Quirinius is governor from 6 to 12 AD. Now, there could be other explanations for this. So this is where people will say it was a different census, just one that wasn't recorded, which is fine, right? But historically, we can't say anything about that, pushing it one way or another. Other people will say that censuses happened at kind of intervals in the Roman Empire, which is true. And so maybe there was one earlier that fell within Herod the Great's reign, and even though it wasn't fully incorporated at that time period, perhaps it still affected that region. People will say that, right? And again, that's kind of like that's true in kind of the facti of it, like the individual arguments. Like it's not so stupid as to be just dismissed out of hand, right? Like I would never say that, and that's and especially because that's what I believe for quite some time, is that that seems to be a likely way of kind of squaring this, because Luke is very aware. It's not that Luke is stupid, right? Luke is aware he said Herod earlier, and now he's saying Quirinius now, so like what's that about? The other one is actually to take the tack that Luke makes a mistake. So this is kind of the tactic of a lot of modern secular biblical scholarship, is they'll say that Luke just makes an error here. He identifies Quirinius wrongly at this time period, or makes up a census in order to justify why Mary and Joseph had to be in Bethlehem, right? So it takes a much more cynical view at the text as a construct and purposely made in order to do this. The problem is that if Luke wanted to lie, right, like he didn't need to do that. He could just say he was in Bethlehem. He didn't have to construe this whole thing that happened, right, in order to do that. I mean, Matthew doesn't give any sort of explanation as to why he's in Bethlehem at all. He just says it happens, right? And that's kind of the interesting part of it, is just that he's there, and he doesn't need to explain it at all, right, Matt? So why didn't Luke do that? That's kind of the ultimate, or not ultimate, but that's kind of the big chink in the armor of that argument, is just that, well, why did he do that when there wasn't a need to do that? It seems like Luke believed this and put it there. So you could go, he made a mistake, or you could do what is presented by a scholar I ran into, and I'll put his paper in the description box below, but just know that it is very academic. So if you're going to read it, there's Greek in there and stuff like that. You can read it and not know Greek, I think, perfectly fine. A little bit of it is going to be too much if you don't get all of that, but you'll be able to get his overall argument that he's making, I think. So his reading of it, and I'm blanking on his name right now, and I don't have it pulled up in front of me, unfortunately, is that he has a very different and kind of radical rereading of this text, only in light of the tradition. So in the Greek, right, Luke uses this phrase, "in those days." And Luke actually uses this phrase quite a bit in the Gospel of Luke and in the book of Acts. And when he does this, it's usually to the thing that it was preceding the text. And he'll actually play with narrative a lot. So it's almost as though he's saying, John grew up and did this, and in those days, right, when John was growing up and being in the wilderness, that's when the decree for the census was issued, and Joseph came to his hometown. And that's to show that Joseph is actually from the line of David, which is important to note. It says that earlier in Luke and in Matthew, right? So it's a way of proving that. And he basically uses this idea of saying, oh yeah, Jesus also was born in Bethlehem. It's kind of like an addendum, which is kind of interesting. I know that sounds weird on the front end, but let me just give you an example of where he does this later. And I get all of this from the scholar, right? This isn't like me being with like being weird or whatever, where Luke likes to play with time and put some events that happen after, before things in the narrative, or vice versa. So in Luke 3, right, this is the beheading, or not the John the Baptist being locked up in jail, right? So he says, this is all about what John was preaching, and it says, so with many other exhortations, he preached good news to the people. But Herod the Tetrarch, who had been reproved by him for Herodias, his brother's wife, and for all the evil things Herod had done, added this to him all, that he locked up John in prison. So he says that John was locked up in prison after preaching. And he says, now, when all of the people were baptized, and when Jesus had been baptized and was praying, the heavens were opened, and the Holy Spirit descended on him in bodily form like a dove, and a voice came from heaven, saying, you are my beloved Son, with you who I am well pleased. So right there, right, you'll actually see that the narrative is odd. John is imprisoned, and then Jesus is baptized, and you get the baptismal narrative that you find in the other Gospels, right? Luke does that. It's something that happens often in the Gospel of Luke. And the guy in the paper, he cites a few other times of that happening, and other times that that Luke uses in those days, and how it refers to what's coming before. So basically the reading he gives, and this is my very bare bones use of it, is that he says, when John did that, there was a decree, basically to link John back with Jesus, right? Is that there's the census that happened, and Joseph had to return home because he's from the tribe of David, right? The city of David, the house of David, which is actually referred to earlier in Luke when Mary is talked about, to be registered with Mary, who was with child, right? And so you have this idea of him, and that there's a little bit of Greek weirdness there, where it's using weird verb forms and things like that to talk about this. So this is the reading that he gives in the paper. He says, during the census of Quirinius, which of course was later than the reign of King Herod, of course he puts that in parentheses, Joseph registered in Bethlehem with Mary. You will remember she was the one who was pregnant during the betrothal period. Now it was actually Bethlehem that her baby was born, back in the time of Herod. That's kind of the way he wants us to think that Luke is writing this, that he's using this time thing in order to link the two and move forward in the narrative, but then pull back and then talk about how Jesus was born there, all relating to how Joseph was still a member of the house of David. And that, to me, like when I first read that, I was like, man, that doesn't sound right. Right? It doesn't sound right because it's not how we tell the story. Right? How often do we tell the story? It starts a church pageant. It starts off by saying, in those days of Caesar Augustus, right? A decree went out from Caesar Augustus. You'll see that a lot. And that's how it's traditionally been interpreted, is that this is happening then. But if we're to take Luke seriously at face value, and to think that he is telling us history, which he is proclaiming to do throughout the whole narrative of the Gospel of Luke, like, what is he trying to get at here when he gives two very separate dates of the occasion of the Annunciation and then Jesus's birth, if we read it that way? But if we read him as doing what he normally does, which is just these odd, sort of jump back, jump forward, jump back sort of thing, in order to tie everything, the importance of Jesus being on the line of David through Joseph, not only that Joseph had to be registered for the census that later happened in Bethlehem, which proves that he's from that area, but also that Jesus was born there, and then this miraculous story happened when Jesus was born, which is basically the way that the scholar wants us to see it. And so that's the third option, and I've become kind of persuaded of that. I think like I still have a lot of research to do and to see what else other people will say. Of course, like if a historian thing turns up, a piece of I would not hang a whole piece of faith on this one way or another. To say it's not true is that it's wrong, right? Because any day now, who knows? We could turn up something from Rome of some document saying that Quirinius carried out an earlier census, right? So, I mean, I think we should take Luke seriously and take it as Luke is writing. It's inspired, right? So, what we can say is we can say that there was a census, that Joseph is from Bethlehem, and that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, right? The timing of that, I think, Luke would push us towards that third reading, but there's other things. All I wanted to say is that's one of the ways. That's probably the biggest way that this reading, close text reading of the story attacks maybe our traditional imagery of the nativity. Of course, there's another one in here. This one is a lot more famous. People become more aware of this recently, but this is verse 7. This is when Mary gives birth to to Jesus, right? She wraps him in swaddling clothes, lays him in a manger. We all love that. We know those words, and then of course there's those final words that are in the King James version and in a lot of English versions, including my beloved English Standard Version, which is there was no place for them in the inn, or no room for them in the inn. As sometimes people will say, right? And this is where you get again this image that we've conjured, right? Mary and Joseph walking through Bethlehem, trying to find a place to go, and the stern and mean innkeeper turning them away because they're not wealthy, or there's not enough room, or whatever else. So they have to go to a stable and give birth in a stable. Now, people have pointed out that this the word here that is used for inn, although in a lot of other recent translations they are changing it to guest room, which is good because that's what it actually means. In the Greek, in the New Testament, this is used for guest rooms. Luke actually does use another word for an inn that is later in the Gospel of Luke, in the story of the Good Samaritan. Remember, the Samaritan takes him and places him in an inn. It's a completely different word than the word that's used here. This is a word that's used for guest room. This is the room that Jesus tells his disciples to go into Jerusalem and prepare a room for them to do the Last Supper in. It's that room. So it's a place where you could stay and eat and sleep, where guests would stay. And so there's no room for them because Joseph has probably gone to stay with relatives because he's from there, right? The house of David. So he's gone there. He's gone to stay with relatives, his family maybe, and he's brought his pregnant wife with him on that journey, and they're staying there, which is actually much more normal, what you would expect a husband and wife to do, right? And but there's no room for them in any of the rooms, so they have to sleep out in the common area of the house, which is where you would bring the animals in at night. And so there they have the child, there Jesus is born, and he's laid in the manger as a place to hold him for a while. And that is when we get, our classic image of what it looks like, right? Or not really what we get our image of, right? Because it's not a barn outside, it's inside someone's house. But yeah, this is just one of those things where you can tell like the imagery, and this isn't a negative thing, by the way, the imagery of like medieval Europe and the way life was lived there impacted the way that so many of us view the stories, because people would just take what they knew and put it in the text or put it in art. And there wasn't this desire or necessity of making it seem exactly like it was in the text. They were a lot more free with playing with that type of thing. So this is a part of the narrative, right? And it's the important thing. It's when Jesus is incarnated, right? That he's found in history, and that it is found in history, right? That's kind of the interesting thing about this, is however you make of the dates, right? Luke wants to be clear that this is a historic thing that happened. Like, that's his argument, right? It's not something that happened later. It's like, no, this happened at a specific time under Herod, and within the context of the Roman Empire being around it, that this is what's going on, right? And so it's really important that we remember that, and that, I guess, is the big takeaway outside of challenging our traditions with Scripture, which is very important. So that's what we talked about today. Long Bible study recap today, but I had to talk through it. Link again to that article will be in the box below. I hope you guys found that interesting, and I will see you next, I guess tomorrow, and then Sunday, and then next week for Bible study, which we're still having. It's still on next week, even though it's Christmas Eve. All right, everyone, have a great day. Peace.